Hi, I'm Chandrasekar Pandyan. You're watching me on DLC Talks, and I'm a person belonging to consulting, evangelizing, and getting on to thinking about design and storytelling with multiple industries from Mindspree Consulting. Design thinking is a human-centered approach, and it leads to innovation that blends people, process, tools, technology for the customer centricity in terms of products or services. That will be getting the better revenues and profitability for any business. So it's a toolkit that integrates the needs of the people and the possibilities of different technologies that can be put into use to enable products, and it enables at large the business successes. This is Tim Brown's statement from IDEO Consulting. So here we are going to talk about how design thinking is going to help all of us, the DLC community all over the world, to think about becoming like a designer and working about in any field which we are in any domain that we are in any tools and technology patterns that we are in, how we can become like a thinker that can integrate the right brain and the left brain, and moving on to have disruptive, innovative, transformational products and services. Design thinking is a sweet spot that we get when we intersect the inspiration with ideation that can be implemented. When we have inspiration, what we mean is we try to think about the best practices, we try to think about the lessons learned from the past, we try to think about the tips and tricks and traps that we have been enriched over the years of our experience, and we bring all those things into our minds and get a mindset that we are prepared to think about Kaizen, continuous improvement, from whatever we see as inspiration. Once that inspiration comes, we get a lot of ideas to think out of the box. Thinking out of the box is feasible only when we know what is within the box first. So thinking out of the box is next practices. Thinking out of the box is trying to think beyond. Thinking out of the box is trying to think about futuristic options in terms of products and services that can disrupt the world in whichever field we are. Once we get those ideation gets rolling out into implementing in action, we get innovations, we get transformations, we get disruptions. This is the first time probably I bring in a kind of a acronym and expansion for design, wherein D stands for discover. What is discover? Discovery of the customer-centric needs, wants, desires. Once we understand the customers' needs, customers' wants, and customers' desires, then and only then we can think about evolving the product or service requirements. If we do not have customer-centric needs, we cannot evolve the requirements of any product and services in the world. Once we evolve the right requirements which are there available as a set for us to work on for a minimum viable product or service, then and only then we try to strategize. What do we strategize? We have to think about planning for action. Whenever we want to plan for action, we need to think about the steps involved in realizing the product or service vision, the expectations and goals and objectives, and connecting the dots with the mission, and moving on to think about how to plan for action. That is strategy. You need to plan, you need to do, you need to check, you need to act. Once that customer-centric needs are strategized with a plan for action, then and only then we try to put the right resources, right capabilities, right competencies, right experts, and right budgets added on to that to realize the requirements to become an innovation. So remember the innovation slide that we have talked about. It can happen only when we have inspiration with ideation and intersected with the implementation. That's a sweet spot. That sweet spot is realized by innovation here. Once we innovate and once we give a product and service to the world, we need to think about how do we grow further and farther. Why do we need to grow? Think about Toyota. When Qualis in India was released and when it was stopped selling vehicle, it stopped and then it moved on to Toyota Innova. Why? The chassis being the same, but the product output and outcome and the luxury has become a little phenomenal betterment from the qualis that was there earlier. So when the product is performing the best, even then we need to think about growing the product to the next level. And that growth can happen with feeding forward, feeding during the cycle of innovation, and feeding back after the innovation is launched. What do I mean by this? Whenever we are getting into delivery of a minimum viable product, we need to think about giving feedback to enable it to become even better and better in an agile fashion. Agile is about being nimble, agile is being flexible, agile is being to listen, empathize, analyze and probe and get to the hold of what is in it for me and how can I better it on a continual basis. So once we move from the feed forward to feed during the cycle of the MVP production, then we move forward to get into consumers and clients giving us feedback. Once the feedback is there, we will be able to nurture the product and services with the versions, revisions, bug fixes, and reaching the functionality and the advantages and benefits to the higher order levels. So we need to think about analyzing and evaluating and creating, nurturing the next level of products and services. How do we use this design that we have seen just now, which is discover, evolve, strategize, innovate, grow, and nurture in action? This is the topmost used framework in the world from Stanford Design School. I call this as an EDIPT framework. E stands for empathizing, D stands for defining, and I stands for ideating, and P stands for prototyping, and then T stands for testing. What do we do in empathize? When we want to empathize with the customers, with the consumers, with the stakeholders, we need to think about visualizing their pain points, their needs and desires, and we need to understand by research what will make sense for them. Think about it. Henry Ford said, if I were to go to the road and if I were to get to understand from the road what is that they want to get from a Ford company, they may have wanted a bullock cart to be faster. But Ford had a car. So that is envisioning with empathy about the end users and customers and consumers. With that, we need to define the statement of work. We need to define the ability and capability of the product and service. Once we define it, we have a statement of work that will be the basis for getting into brainstorming, getting into people from different subject matter expertise to come as an agile team and to think about what needs to be done to brainstorm, to get ideas that can transform into solutions. Once the solutions come with desirability of the customer, intersected with the feasibility of the internal team, intersected with the possibility of business getting a viable profitability and revenues, that will be the candidate for minimum viable product to be prototyped. We need to check the assumptions, we need to check the risk, we need to check the constraints, and we need to think about how we can rapidly build the prototype to become a product. And then we need to think about testing it with cross-functional teams. And once the cross-functional teams are testing it, then we go to the real masses of the market and then test it. Why do we do that? Because we want to get into a story that can be given for the audience and the masses. Who are we doing the product for? Who are we doing the services for? That is empathy. And what are we going to do? That is definition of the product and services. And how are we going to do it? We get ideas, we get prototype, we get testing done, and now is the time for branding, positioning, marketing, business development, and trying to make the entire world know that we have a story that will enable them to understand a customer-centric innovation has been born, and that is something that they're going to use and get the right benefits thereon. What is discovery? Discovery is about empathizing and understanding the customer requirements. What is interpretation. Interpretation is to get the stories and give the stories and then understand what kind of things that we need to interpret to have the right set of desires. Because you go to people and ask what they want, they'll say everything. There is no pattern. So moving on without the patterns, but getting on to understand what could be the common minimum viable product kind of a statement of work, we need to interpret. We need to interpret stories, we need to interpret benchmarks, we need to interpret best practices. That makes us to get into a real base for making people to get ideas. And the prototyping is now mapped in IDEO for business users to call this as an experimentation. If you want to invent something, if you want to innovate something, there is a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. And I say that frustration is the father of invention. So when you are frustrated, you invent something new. When you are necessitated with something to be done, you think different. So experimenting is key. Once those experiments are on, the last part of the IDEO framework that suggests how design thinking to be put into action is to evolve a product and service that is customer-centric. When we evolve the customer-centric product and services, we need to now know, okay, we are evolving, but if we have to necessitate this kind of an evolution to happen with every one of the DLC members here, they need to be given an augmented set of tools. So what kind of tools that can be given for empathizing and defining? What kind of tools can be given for ideation? What can be the tools for prototyping? What can be the tools for testing? What is about getting to visualize the customer-centric needs, trying to understand the persona maps and the customer journey mapping, because that is required for us to understand where all the pain points are there, where all the gains they want, what kind of desires they want. And to define, we need to have another set of two tools. Value chain analysis. We are finding the value that we are giving as a value proposition to the customers. Mind mapping is about either realizing the clusters of different things that we need to do to get a great product. And moving on to what if is about brainstorming and getting better at how do we substitute, how do we combine, how do we adopt, how do we magnify, how do we put things into use, and how do we get into eliminating something and make it become a great product, and how do we land in a great innovation. So when we move from the what is, we are moving away from the empathy and define, and we get into ideation. Ideation is about getting solutions, getting brainstorms from the real people who are subject matter experts, but not every idea will wow people. And last but not the least, you need to think about how to get feedback all the time, and that is where you need to think about learning launches. Learning launches is all about learn, unlearn, and relearn. Once we do that, we get into the design, the ramp that happens in the world. So my dear friends, summarizing the design thinking for customer-centric innovation, are we able to visualize what the customers are thinking about getting it from us? Are we able to map their journey so that we can make a customer-centric innovation? Do we have a value chain analysis that can be resulting in a business value proposition? And do we have the mind mapping that gets us to think about, yes, this is what the customer wants, we can brainstorm. And once we brainstorm, we need to really think about concept development, because reality is different from just ideas. And assumptions, risks, limitations need to be tested, my dear friends. That will make a wow in terms of prototyping. Prototyping is all about trying to prove things are working from ideas to solutions. Testing is all about trying to think about proving that things may not work well. So what do? We get customers to co-create with us, to sit with us, to envisage, to understand what kind of things that they want it to be different in the product and service. And with that input, with that feedback, the product gets enriched in the minimum viable product sense. But after the minimum viable product is born, we do the learning launches with the real potential customers in the world out there, and we know what works. So design thinking, my dear friends, is for customer-centric innovation. As a DLC member, all of us should own our accountability in order to think about everyone that we serve to be brought with the finest products in line with their desires. To enable that to happen, we all have knowledge, aplenty. But are we sharing our knowledge with the different communities? Do we enable them to become practitioners? Do we share the best practices and lessons? Do we ask them to reuse if it is better? And do we ask them to stop and take a pass to understand the lesson and then avoid it? Do we share the tips and tricks and traps that we encounter in our projects? Be accountable, my dear friends, to share these things. This is like a parachute. If you think about parachutes that has to work well, it has to open. So our minds are like parachutes. Why don't we open that up as a large community, share and gain knowledge, and enable people to understand they can continue the innovations which you stopped somewhere and then get it even more transformational and disruptional. So as a community, please have accountability, my dear friends, to enable every one of us to share, because multiple minds getting to share, getting to give, getting to practice, getting to put it into use will enable all the enterprises to get great customer-centric innovation by design.